Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with Professor Daniel Cohen from Paris School of Economics, of which he's a founding member. His research interests are very vast, and they go from growth, that will be actually the topic of today's Max Weber lecture, to debt crisis. And so the first question that I want to ask you, given your wide research interests, it's so if you had to recommend one book to young academics in social sciences that they should have read but they might have missed, what would be your recommendation?
I think it could be the book by Jared Diamond, Germs, Guns, and Steel. I forgot the exact order because in France it's a very crazy translation. But I think this is an extraordinary book. It's been a bestseller in the US for some time, and it sets as a question at the beginning of the book an extraordinary one, which is why is it that it's a West which is rich at the beginning of the 16th century and the rest of the world which is about to be colonized by the West. In particular, why is it that the Americas seems to be so much behind the Western world, and he has a very straight answer, which is that the West is part of Eurasia, there's a long continuum of land, and to put it very simply, Eurasia is on the east-west axis, when Americas and Africa are on the north-south axis, and to put it very simply, east-west axis means that if you discover something in Italy or in France, it can go all the way to Japan because it's the same temperature. So any discovery in agriculture in particular can pass all the borders, so to speak, of the world. In the north-south axis, you find something in the south, it doesn't reach the north. So there were very few mammals in America. There was just the llama, essentially, that resembled the horse, and it never made it to North America because it couldn't cross the Ecuador and the change of climate. So this is just a fascinating book with many other insights, which I would recommend as an entry into what we should know of the world at large before we specialize into economics or anything else.
Thank you. And this brings us back to the topic of today's Max Weber lecture, so economic growth, and this has been for a long time at the very core of the discipline. But my question is, this has of course implication for our social scientists, also for scholars in humanities. And so what do you think is the main message that as economists in the profession we have to provide, we have to transmit to our colleagues? And also, conversely, what is the message we should get from social sciences at large and humanities that you think we might have missed?
Well, as a starter, I think, yes, obviously economic growth ever since, let's say, Adam Smith, although it was not strictly speaking about growth but wealth, but yeah. Let's not play with the word, is in effect the core topic of the economist. I think it's Robert Lucas in Chicago who said once you start thinking about these issues, it's very difficult to focus on any other topic. So yes, this is the key question. But I think it's more important for the other social science than for the economist to know, in fact, what's in it. Because for the economist, it's a question of model, it's a question of focusing on this or that, and they will always, find ways to argue within the same paradigms. For the rest of the humanities, it's absolutely essential to have precise ideas, not just on the level of economic growth, but also on the nature of economic growth. And I think that will be the topic, mostly, in fact, of my lecture this afternoon. It matters very much for the political scientists, for the social scientists at large, to understand why is it that our societies seems to be totally disrupted today by the new process of economic transformation, and growth is of course the core dimensions of it, not just, again, the amount of growth, the distribution of growth, the nature of growth. So, of course, inequalities is part of it, but not just inequalities, the nature of work. All these things are completely re-engineered in the world that we live now, and for the economists, beyond the sheer issue of whether we can bet on 1.5 or 2, I think there's really a dialogue with the other professions, the other social scientists, to understand the kind of questions that they ask, and I think they are very much related, very often, to the nature of the modern, the post-industrial world, as I think we should call it.
And so, once again, you mentioned growth, economic growth, wealth, well-being. So you will mention today Easterlin's paradox, where well-being stagnates even if income increases. Long before Easterlin, Richard Wagner foresaw that as income was increasing, also the role of the government in the economy, how much the government will spend, would have changed. So is there a role for the government in this, in somehow interfering with Easterlin's paradox? And we see many different types of government roles in the economies, both in Europe, so let's say the different role of government in Spain or Italy compared to Scandinavian countries, or the role of the government in China versus India. So
I think the government is the main victim of the Easterlin paradox, because when growth is reduced, is lowered, if we take the Easterlin paradox as, meaning that people want more income than they have, whatever the starting point may be, the reduction of growth means that they are willing to sacrifice a number of goods which are supplied by the government in name of having more purchasing power. What Reagan discovered as a political recipe is that if you promise to reduce taxes, you are very popular, because reducing taxes is a short-run gain. And of course, the consequences in terms of government expenditures are longer termed, so you don't see them immediately. And I think this has been somehow one of the reasons why the promise to cut taxes at a time where inequalities were rising, and therefore you would expect that the pendulum would go the other way around. That's very much to do with the Easterlin paradox, which is that you want here and now income rather than later on in the future. Beyond that, I think that this post-industrial society that I was referring to is changing the nature of the goods which are produced. It's not anymore a question of having more income to buy cars and things like that. And when you look at the long run, Wagner kind of social expenditures such as education, health, I would also include housing, and I would say the urban civilization that we live in. The government has very much to say about it, certainly education and health, but also I think in terms of engineering the urban revolution. And because of this Easterlin paradox, people again are not willing as much as they should, I think, or as much as the tendency of social demands tell us that they should, to sacrifice current income against education and health. If you think about health, which is a fascinating topic, this is where the action is taking place. In the US, the share of health expenditures as a percentage of GDP is already twice the share of the whole industrial production. This tells about how much is going on there. But everywhere in the world, the governments want to reduce health expenditure. They view that as a cost, and this is somehow surprising. Of course, there are ways, and you can always do better, but the tendency, I think, point to the fact that health may be maybe to the 21st century what we say car production was to the 20th. That is the engine of innovation and where growth is maybe taking place. But we don't view it as an engine of growth. We view it as a cost, maybe because it's an investment in part, but this has very much to do with the change that we don't produce the same kind of goods, that the government has a role, but somehow the government's actions are limited by the willingness to have more income to spend immediately.
So you say there is a time inconsistency that somehow has to be. And again, I'll return to our role as scholars here in the Max Weber program. We have young academics very engaged in their research and also willing to give a contribution at large from law, political science, history, economics, of course. What what is the reshaped role of social sciences in this different world with this time inconsistency? What is our message?
No, I think, first of all, I think the economic profession over the past 30 years has dramatically changed with respect to what it was when I started my own studies. It is much more data consuming than it used to be. You want to know the facts. There are still theories, obviously, and you need to think or rethink many of them. But I think that the pendulum in terms of theory versus fact has definitely swung towards facts. That's the first change, and we should welcome that. Again, I like theories, and myself, I'm a trained mathematician, so I'm eager to write down the proper equations. But I see that the profession has gained a lot from the big data world in which we live, and that's very good. Also, this process has changed the way we look at the Homo economicus. We are much more willing to accept that it has a lot of inconsistency, in particular the time inconsistency dimension, and that's very important. We want to factor in that kind of parameter in our model. All the nudge literature, of course, builds upon that. The role of the state with respect to that can be entirely rethought as a way perhaps of solving the dynamic inconsistencies that the individuals are faced with. All the work of Estelle Duflo and Banerjee are about the fact that development is about solving through the proper institution inconsistency that the individual is not able to manage. The trade-off between, for instance, educating the children versus spending one more cup of tea is very complicated, morally speaking, philosophically speaking. That's part of the things where the economist needs to discuss, and all the things that incidentally we mentioned on the nature of work. It's not just for the economist to decide the relationship between productivity and what have you. It's also a question of what is it that people work, what do they expect from their work. Kerloff some time ago discussed the fairness of wages, not so much the content of work. And this is the question today. What kind of work do you want to do, as much as how much you want to make? And that's part of, I think, the discussion that the economists would benefit from discussion with the other social scientists.
Yeah. So maybe we should rethink about making history of economic thought and economic history compulsory courses in our degrees, maybe.
Maybe, but as you know, the Eastern paradox itself is not a fact. It's very much debated. There's a lot of resistance to accept it, in part because perhaps scientifically there's more to it than simply the paradox itself. But we need also to understand more what it means in itself and what it means for the society to handle this paradox.
And we discussed the role of government, and this will easily bring us to the current debate about debt crisis. We talked about the service that the government offers, the unwillingness to pay. Does this mean that also thinking that growing out of debt, that was a catchphrase at some stage, it's not a feasible scenario anymore? Should we reconsider our approach to sovereign debt?
I think the paradox of the time is that we have sovereign debt crisis within Europe in particular, and we may have one with the commodity exporters given the collapse of primary commodities. But within Europe, it's paradoxical that we had to face a sovereign debt crisis at a time when the interest rates are so low. What determines the risk of a debt crisis is when the cost of servicing the debt becomes very expensive compared to the government's revenues, and look at Japan, huge debt, and no problem because the interests are zero. And what matters for the burden of debt is debt times the interest rate. So the interest rate is zero, whatever times zero makes a zero. So the reason why we had a sovereign debt crisis is because our institutions within Europe created a self-fulfilling panic to a large extent. Maybe Greece is a counter-example to what I'm saying, but the way the debt crisis sprawled into Spain, even Ireland and Italy at one point, even France was contaminated by this crisis with spreads rising very much, has demonstrated that there was a misconception of of the Eurozone, which created this kind of self-fulfilling panic, simply for the fact that there is no lender of last resort. So if you say to a country you have a large debt, but you're on your own, if you have problems, nobody will rescue you. Of course, that creates very rapidly a sense of fragility. So I think the sovereign debt crisis, again, is a long history and certainly will rebound in the future with the commodity exporters crash. But within Europe, we should not confuse that with, it should not be an excuse for us not to see the weaknesses of the European construction at the very beginning. The role of the central bank, which has been changed with Mario Draghi's stance, the lack of a banking union, the fact that there's, the public debt, there's no kind of mutualization of the risk, even at some level. So all these things, I think should be put on the table before we think of a new IMF way of managing Europe. I think that the priority is more with institutions such as we have them today.
Yeah, again, that's something that maybe looking at past experiences could have helped in the design, because it wasn't really that new.
What was new really was the fact that usually in sovereign debt crisis of the past, of the old ways, the one that I've studied in my life, is that you borrow your Brazil, you borrow in dollars, and when you don't have those dollars, there's nothing you can do about it. If your export revenues fall, then suddenly for some reason, which may be well-founded, nobody wants to refinance you, then by definition you're out of cash and you die. There's no way you can create dollars, and very often exchange rate crises are at the origin or come together with the problem of servicing the debt. So in the case of Europe, we created a strange beast because we borrow in our own currency. Greece borrowed in euros, Spain, Ireland borrowed in euros. So somehow the exchange rate risk was not there anymore, and that is very often correlated with sovereign debt crisis of the past. On the other hand, we borrow in our own currency, but we don't print that currency. So we are in an intermediate world, somehow unheard of for a long time. So this is why there is an element of novelty that we need to deal with. It's not just in the past, but yes, you're right. The past should have told us that early resolution is better than late resolution, for instance.
Yeah, that was the case for previous defaults quite clearly. So thank you for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to your lecture later on, and thanks again for having accepted to be here as a guest of the Max Weber program.
Thank you for the invitation.